Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am the Omni viewer, and something has survived. In fact, it's survived since the late 90s, but I'll bet most of you didn't even remember it existed. While going through some of my old books recently, I was surprised to find a lost piece of Jurassic Park media. This role-playing game book based on the Lost World Jurassic Park, complete with all the cards still intact. Yup. The Lost World Jurassic Park was the most anticipated movie of 1997, being a sequel to the biggest dinosaur movie ever made, and anticipation of how big it would be resulted in all kinds of merchandise that the first movie didn't get. This book was such an item, and it was actually the first role-playing book I ever purchased. Since the Jurassic movies are still going strong, I figured it was time to blow the dust off this tome and see how it holds up after all these years. Okay, so setup is simple. All you need is the book, the 24 cards that come with the book, and a 6-sided die. Pretty straightforward, right? First step is to look to the cards. In order to play, you have to divide them into 3 decks. One deck is for characters, one is for dinosaurs, and one is for plants. There is also a DNA card, but you just set that aside at the beginning. It'll come back into play later. Let's take a closer look at the cards before we get too far into this, because we need to understand how they work in order to play the game. Character cards, naturally, represent the character you play. There are 8 in total, and as you can see, they are all characters from the movie, a mix of heroes and villains. Each card has a photo of the character, a list of stats, a brief description, and a quote from the movie. Flip it over, and there's an extra bonus you can add to any particular stat. Which character you pick is important because that will determine where you start playing. If you pick a hero, you can start the book from the very beginning, but if you pick a villain, you have to start at the midway point. The smallest of the 3 decks is the plant deck with 4 cards total, one of which is not even a plant but a bug. They contain an image and a paragraph of info about each subject, and although they're not the most interesting part of the game, the art is still well done. It's slightly more detailed than the trading cards that came with the classic Jurassic Park action figures, but not nearly as cool as those. And finally, we have the dinosaur cards, 11 in all. The art here mostly seems to be concept art, with the lone exception being the Compsognathus, which is a recolored photograph of the physical puppet. They also contain information, but unlike the paragraphs on the plant cards, it's all broken down into bullet points here. Naturally, when I was a kid, this deck was the most interesting part of the game to me. It really is a shame that you can't play as a dinosaur, but such is the way of things. Okay, so like I said, once character selection is done, the game can begin. Although, calling it a game might be a bit generous. The book covers pretty much the entire stay on Isla Sorna, divided into 3 sections. Part 1 is when Team Hammond arrives on the island, and you can start there if your character is part of that group. Part 2 is when Team Ludlow arrives, and you start there if your character is from that group. Part 3 is when the 2 groups join together and head for the center of the island where the radio is. The way you play it is to basically follow what the book says. Every so often, it gives you a decision to make and tells you what page to turn to depending on your choice. So it's like one of those choose-your-own-adventure books? For the most part, yes, though it is slightly more interactive. At certain points, the player is given an action to perform based on one of 4 stats. Agility requires coordination and athletics, strength is about lifting or moving heavy items, perception is about attention to detail, and mind is general intelligence. You perform these actions by rolling the die, then adding the number to the stat in question, accounting for any bonuses the character might have. If you pass the minimum number for the action, that's the good result. If you don't pass, though, things don't go so well. Sometimes, though, it comes down not to the roll of the die, but to the perception of the player. Certain parts of the book will present you with a dinosaur or plant, but it won't tell you the type. It just gives you a few hints and options for what it might be. That's where the Dino and Plant decks come in. You have to line up what the book tells you with what's on the cards. Identify the dinosaur correctly, and your odds of surviving are a bit better. Then, every so often, the DNA card comes up. That's the wild card, and when it's in play, the adventure proceeds depending on what you roll. This can be anything from getting injured to successfully dodging a dinosaur attack. Rolling a 6 means you can roll again, which could be either good or bad. Depending on how these decisions and dice rolls go, you might play out the movie's events exactly, or you might get eaten by a T-Rex midway through. Okay, but it's still basically a choose-your-own-adventure book. Well, yeah, I guess that is the long and the short of it. As role-playing games go, there isn't really a lot of room for the actual role-playing part, and if you've seen the movie, there are very few surprises in store. Heck, the replay value is bound to wear off after only a few tries, especially if you know how to identify the dinosaurs. That said, I suppose someone with a strong enough imagination could use the cards as a jumping-off point for a homebrew game of some sort. Of course, that would require you to have a copy of this in the first place. I've actually spoken to some people in the days building up to this video who didn't even know this was a thing. It seems the world forgot about it, so I decided to remind everybody that it exists. Because even if it's not all that intricate, that doesn't mean it deserves to be forgotten. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off. You know, a proper Jurassic Park RPG would actually be pretty cool. Wonder if anybody's done one of those yet.